The man who humiliated me at my own wedding thought it was just a joke. But when that man turned out to be my employee's husband, and his actions threatened my business and reputation, I made sure karma came for him in a way he'd never forget. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. I never imagined that one day I'd have to fire someone's husband because of what happened at my own wedding. It sounds absurd when I say it out loud, like some kind of petty power move. But the truth is, it wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. My wedding was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. After years of running my own business, holding everything together, and finally finding someone who saw me for who I truly was, I wanted a moment of peace, of celebration. Everything about that day had been carefully planned. The garden venue, the soft gold tones, the laughter of people I trusted. I wanted to be surrounded by love, not drama. But that illusion shattered in an instant. The moment an uninvited voice grabbed the microphone during the reception. It was my employee's husband, Mark. He had this reputation, even before the wedding, for being that guy. The kind of man who thought sarcasm was a personality, who loved the sound of his own voice a little too much. I'd tolerated his smug little comments at company parties, mostly for the sake of professionalism. He was married to Sarah, one of my best employees, and I didn't want to create tension where there didn't need to be any. Still, when I saw him stumble up to the microphone, beer in hand, grinning like he'd just been crowned the night's entertainment, my stomach dropped. I could already feel where this was going. At first, people thought it was part of the schedule, a friend giving a toast. But within seconds, it was clear this wasn't a toast. It was an ambush. He started with a mock cheer, saying how lucky my new husband was to have a boss for a wife. There were a few awkward chuckles. I tried to smile, brushing it off, even as my cheeks burned. But then he kept going. He joked about my work habits, saying I probably scheduled my honeymoon like a business meeting. He said things like, "Let's hope she doesn't start managing your marriage the way she manages her employees." Or, "Poor guy, you're doomed." People started shifting uncomfortably in their seats. My husband reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it, a small gesture that kept me grounded as I felt a mix of embarrassment and disbelief wash over me. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, he mimicked my voice, pretending to give orders the way he imagined I did at work. The crowd fell silent. Even the DJ didn't know what to do. The microphone squealed as he laughed at his own joke. My heart was pounding in my ears. I forced a tight smile, pretending to laugh. But inside, something cold settled in my chest. The kind of cold that comes from realizing you've just been made a fool of, in front of everyone you love. I remember locking eyes with Sarah across the room. Her face was pale, mortified. She looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. I could tell she hadn't expected this either, but that didn't make it hurt any less. When he finally sat down, grinning, proud of himself, there was no applause. Just the sound of awkward clinking glasses and a few forced laughs. My husband leaned in and whispered, "Ignore him. He just showed everyone who he really is." I nodded, swallowing hard. But I knew deep down, this wasn't something I could just brush off. This was a line crossed, a deep, personal violation dressed up as humor. That night, after the guests left and I sat in silence still wearing my wedding dress, I replayed his words over and over. Every joke, every smirk. I wasn't angry yet, not in the explosive, shouting sense. It was quieter than that. He'd taken something from me. The purity of that moment, the memory of my own wedding day, and turned it into a spectacle. I didn't know it then, but that was only the beginning. What started as humiliation would soon turn into a battle for my professional integrity. And in the end, Mark would learn that when you mock someone's dignity in public, karma has a way of laughing last. After the wedding, I found myself replaying the entire incident, trying to understand how things had gotten so out of hand. It wasn't just about one bad joke. It was about boundaries, about how people like Mark always seemed to think that women in power were fair game for ridicule. Before all of this happened, life had been, if not perfect, at least predictable. I ran a mid-sized marketing firm that I'd built from the ground up. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and I was proud of it. My employees respected me, and I respected them. I'd always tried to be the kind of boss who understood that people had lives outside of work. We had flexible hours, paid maternity leave, even small team retreats twice a year. I believed in treating people well, and for the most part, it worked. Sarah was one of my most trusted employees. She'd joined us 5 years earlier, bright, quick on her feet, and good at reading clients. She had this calm professionalism that made her a great buffer between me and the chaos that often came with running a business. If someone had asked me, before the wedding, who my most dependable team member was, I would have said her name without hesitation. But Sarah had one blind spot: her husband, Mark. From the first time I met him at a company party, I could tell he was a handful, not in the dangerous sense, but in that socially exhausting way. The kind of man who believes every thought that enters his head is worth saying out loud. He'd interrupt conversations, make off-color jokes, and try to one-up people with little stories about himself. At one event, when he found out I was the owner of the company, he smirked and said, "So you're the big boss my wife's always talking about. Guess I know who to blame for her late nights." He meant it as a joke, of course, but the condescending tone stuck with me. Sarah always tried to smooth things over. "He doesn't mean anything by it," she'd say with that nervous laugh that told me she knew he did. I would smile, let it slide, and move on, because she was good at her job. And because, frankly, I didn't want to punish her for having a husband who couldn't control his mouth. There were other moments too. Small, subtle red flags. During meetings where we brought families along, he'd make comments about how I must be married to my work, or that I looked like the kind of woman who always wins arguments. I learned to shrug them off, to tell myself it didn't matter what someone's spouse thought of me. But deep down, I knew there was something in him that resented women like me. Women who built their own lives and didn't need validation from men like him. Outside of those occasional encounters, work life was stable. We were expanding into a new market, landing big clients, and I was finally in a place where I could relax a little. Enough to plan my wedding, without feeling guilty about taking time off. When I invited my employees to the wedding, I did it because I genuinely cared about them. We'd built something together. It felt right to share the day with the people who had helped me get there. Sarah, of course, RSVP'd yes, and asked if she could bring her husband. I said yes without hesitation. At the time, it felt like the kind and inclusive thing to do if only I had trusted my gut instead. Because looking back, the warning signs were there all along. The smirks, the subtle jabs, the way he seemed to enjoy making me uncomfortable. He wasn't harmless. He was the kind of man who hides cruelty behind charm, who disguises insults as humor, and as much as I tried to dismiss it as nothing, as just Mark being Mark, That wedding speech proved what I had ignored for too long. Some people will push and push until they find the line they can cross. And when they do, they'll do it with a smile. I wish I could say that after the wedding, I simply moved on. But people like Mark don't stop when they think they've gotten away with something. And in his mind, he hadn't humiliated me. He thought he'd won. That was the energy he carried forward. Even after that night, the jokes, the smugness, the whispers that trickled back to me through coworkers. He thought it was funny, but as I was about to learn, he was only setting himself up for the biggest fall of his life, and I was about to stop letting things slide. The morning after the wedding, I woke up to that strange, hollow quiet that always follows a big event. My husband was still asleep beside me, and for a few minutes, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that I could move past what had happened. But no matter how many times I told myself to let it go, I couldn't shake the embarrassment. It clung to me like a second skin. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the laughter, see Mark's smug grin, feel the heat rising in my cheeks as I forced myself to smile through it. I didn't want my new marriage to begin with bitterness, so I tried to bury the incident under the chaos of post-wedding life. Thank you notes, travel plans, and a mountain of laundry. By the time I returned to the office a week later, I'd almost convinced myself that it was behind me. Almost. When I walked into the office that Monday, the usual warmth felt off. Conversations seemed to stop when I entered the room, and people gave me those overly polite smiles that always mean someone's talking behind your back. My stomach tightened. Sarah approached me not long after, looking sheepish. Hey, I just wanted to apologize for what happened at your wedding, she began, wringing her hands. Mark can be, well, you know how he is. He didn't mean anything by it. There it was, the same excuse I'd heard a dozen times before. He didn't mean anything by it. I nodded slowly, keeping my voice even. I appreciate that, Sarah. I just think it went too far this time. It wasn't appropriate, and it put both of us in a bad position. She nodded quickly, agreeing, but her eyes darted away, like she knew there was more she wasn't saying. I'll talk to him, she murmured. He feels terrible. I wanted to believe her, but later that afternoon, as I was going through emails, I got a notification on my phone, a tag on social media. It was a video. My heart dropped before I even opened it. There was Mark, in his living room, standing in front of a fake microphone, reenacting his wedding speech for the camera. The caption read, "When your boss gets married, but you can't resist a good roast." He'd actually recorded himself mocking me again, and posted it for everyone to see. The video had already been shared several times. There were laughing emojis, comments like she probably fired her assistant for not laughing, and this guy's a legend. I felt physically sick. My wedding, the most personal day of my life, had become a viral joke. My name wasn't directly mentioned, but it didn't need to be. People in our professional circle would know. My clients would know. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the screen, alternating between anger and disbelief. My husband read over my shoulder, silent for a long time before finally saying, "You can't let him get away with this." I nodded slowly. "I won't." The next morning, I called Sarah into my office. She looked nervous before she even sat down. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I just showed her the video. Her face went white. "Oh my God," she whispered. He didn't tell me he posted it." "I swear I didn't know, Sarah," I said carefully. "I understand you're not responsible for his actions, but this affects the company. It affects me, and I can't ignore that." She apologized again and again, promising to make him take it down. And, to her credit, the video disappeared a few hours later. But the damage was already done. For the rest of that week, I kept catching whispers in the office. People talking about the wedding roast video, pretending they weren't. I held my head high, pretending not to notice. But every quiet laugh and sideways glance felt like another tiny cut. The humiliation from the wedding had followed me into my professional life. It wasn't just personal anymore. It was public. And the one thing I had always protected, the thing I had built with every ounce of effort I had, was now being chipped away by one man's arrogance. That was the moment the line was crossed. I could forgive an awkward speech at a wedding. I could even forgive a poor sense of humor. But turning my wedding into a viral mockery, endangering my reputation, my credibility, that was something else entirely. I realized then that this wasn't just about a bad joke. It was about control. Mark thought he could take from me my dignity, my peace, and hide behind humor when he went too far. But what he didn't know was that I wasn't the kind of woman who stayed quiet when pushed too far. He had turned my wedding into his stage. I was about to turn his arrogance into his downfall. For a few days after that meeting, I told myself things might settle down. The video was deleted, and Sarah seemed genuinely embarrassed. I hoped that maybe, just maybe, Mark had learned his lesson, that he'd feel enough shame to stay in his lane and leave me and my business alone. But people like Mark don't learn lessons easily. They mistake silence for weakness. And my attempt at professionalism, my choice not to make a bigger scene, only emboldened him. It started subtly. A few days later, one of my co-workers forwarded me a screenshot of another post from Mark's social media. It was a meme, a still shot from his deleted video, captioned, "When your boss's wedding is the only time you're allowed to tell the truth." He hadn't tagged me directly this time, but he didn't have to. The tone, the timing, everyone who saw it knew exactly who he meant. When I saw it, a familiar chill crept up my neck. The same cold embarrassment I'd felt at my wedding returned, only this time it was laced with anger. I took a long breath and reminded myself to stay calm. This was not just some personal squabble anymore. I had a company to protect, employees to lead, and a reputation that had taken me over a decade to build. I wasn't going to let one man's childishness jeopardize that. The next morning, I called Sarah in again. Her face told me everything before I said a word. She already knew what I was about to bring up. "I saw the post," I said quietly, sliding my phone across the desk. She glanced at the screen and sighed, rubbing her forehead. "I've told him to stop," she said. "He thinks it's harmless. He says it's not about you specifically. It is about me," I cut in. My tone still even but sharper now. "And it's about my company. Clients follow me online. Our staff does too. His posts reflect on you. And by extension, they reflect on us. I can't ignore that." She nodded, her voice cracking slightly. "I'll talk to him again. I'm so sorry, really. He doesn't understand how serious this is." That part was true. He didn't. He didn't understand professionalism. He didn't understand restraint. And he certainly didn't understand that actions have consequences. A few days later, I got an email from one of our long-term clients, someone who had attended the wedding. They congratulated me on the marriage, but there was a line that made my stomach twist. "Saw that funny clip your friend posted online. You've got quite a sense of humor about yourself." I sat at my desk for several minutes just staring at the screen. It was sinking in now. This wasn't just my embarrassment anymore. This was affecting my brand. The business I'd spent years building on professionalism and trust was now being quietly mocked, even by clients who didn't mean any harm. By the end of that week, I started to notice a shift in how people spoke to me. Subtle, but there. Jokes about me being strict or the boss who runs her own wedding. Nothing outright cruel, but enough to sting. Enough to remind me that I had become, in some circles, the punchline of a story I never agreed to tell. And Mark, he wasn't done. That weekend, a mutual acquaintance sent me another video he'd posted, a short clip of himself holding a beer and saying, "If your wife's boss gets mad at a joke, just remind her that weddings are for fun, not performance reviews." He laughed into the camera. Then, the caption, "Some people just can't take a joke." It was infuriating, but also predictable. This was how people like him operated. They pushed, mocked, provoked, then hid behind humor when called out. I showed my husband the post that evening. He watched it silently, then looked at me with a kind of calm protectiveness that steadied me. "You've been more than patient," he said, "but you can't keep pretending this isn't affecting you or your business." He was right. I'd tried diplomacy. I'd tried giving Sarah space to handle it privately. But Mark had made it clear. He had no intention of stopping. The following Monday, I sent a company-wide email reminding everyone about our social media policy. No posts or comments that could reflect negatively on the firm or its leadership. I didn't name names, but everyone knew who it was for. That same afternoon, Sarah knocked on my door again. Her face was red, eyes tired. "He's furious," she said quietly. "He thinks you're targeting him." I sighed. "Sarah, I'm not targeting anyone, but I have to protect my reputation, and I need to make something clear. If his behavior continues, it could have consequences for you too. I don't want that. But you need to understand the position this puts me in." She nodded, her lips pressed tight. "I understand," but her tone told me she didn't. Not really. Not yet, because in Mark's world, nothing was ever his fault. In his mind, he was the victim of a humorless boss who couldn't take a joke. And instead of taking responsibility, he did what people like him always do. He doubled down. That week, he began showing up to company events again, uninvited this time, pretending he was just picking Sarah up, but lingering long enough to make snide comments to anyone who would listen. The tension was growing, and it was only a matter of time before something snapped. And when it did, it wouldn't just be an uncomfortable situation anymore. It would become the breaking point. The moment I decided that enough was enough, and that this man was about to learn exactly what it felt like to mock the wrong person. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing about breaking points, they creep up on you, quietly, until you wake up one morning and realize you've crossed an invisible line. The line between patience and resolve, between letting things go and taking control. For weeks, I tried to maintain professionalism. I told myself that as long as I stayed calm, as long as I didn't let him get under my skin, this would all fade into the background. But Mark didn't fade. He multiplied. The social media posts became bolder, the jokes sharper. I stopped looking at his accounts, but screenshots found their way to me anyway. Coworkers trying to be helpful, clients asking if it was true, even my husband, concerned about how it might affect our business. And then came the moment that truly changed everything. It was a Thursday morning. I was preparing for a high-profile client presentation, the kind of meeting that could take our company to the next level. I was nervous, but ready. Every detail had been checked twice. The conference room was set up, the projector working, the coffee hot. About 10 minutes before the meeting started, my assistant hurried in looking pale. "You should see this," she whispered, handing me her phone. I glanced at the screen and my blood ran cold. It was a new video from Mark. He was sitting in his car, laughing, pretending to give a motivational speech about bad bosses. He didn't say my name, but the references were unmistakable. The captions read, "Some people think being a boss means being the bride and the groom at the same time. Newsflash, control doesn't make you classy." I could feel my pulse in my ears. This wasn't just another joke. It was a public taunt, posted on the very morning of one of the biggest meetings of my career. And as I scrolled through the comments, some laughing, some mocking, it became clear that people in my professional circle had already seen it. I stared at that screen, frozen. My first instinct was humiliation, that old familiar burn in my chest. But underneath it, something heavier was stirring. Not anger exactly, clarity. This man wasn't going to stop. And as long as he was tied to my company through his wife, his actions would continue to stain everything I'd worked for. The client meeting went smoothly. Somehow, I forced myself to compartmentalize, smiling, presenting, nodding in all the right places. But inside, I'd already made my decision. When the meeting ended and everyone filed out, I sat alone in the conference room for a while, hands folded on the table. The city hummed outside the glass walls, and I let the silence settle in. I was done being embarrassed, done letting this man take up space in my mind, in my company, in my peace. That afternoon, I called Sarah into my office. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping much. I could see the guilt written across her face. "I saw the new video," I said quietly. Her eyes welled up immediately. "I told him not to post it," she whispered. "He said it wasn't about you." I leaned forward, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Sarah, I've been more than patient, but this has gone far beyond what's acceptable. It's affecting our clients, our image, and me personally. I need you to understand, if this continues, I'll have no choice but to take formal action." She nodded quickly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I understand. I really do. I'll talk to him tonight." I believed she meant it. But that evening, just as I was packing up to leave, I got a message from one of our biggest clients, the kind of message that makes your stomach drop before you even open it. "Hey, just checking in, everything okay over there? We saw some posts about your wedding online. Didn't realize it was connected to your team. Hope it's nothing serious." I read the message 3 times. My client, the one we just met with, had connected this. And worse, he thought this was some kind of company-wide joke. I could feel the heat rising in my chest again. But this time it wasn't embarrassment. It was resolve. That was the final straw. I went home that night, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat at the dining table with my laptop. I opened the HR files, reviewing every detail of our employee policies and contracts. I wasn't looking for revenge, I was looking for leverage. For a way to protect my business that was both ethical and airtight, somewhere between frustration and determination. I found exactly what I was looking for. And as I read the clause over and over again, a slow, calm satisfaction began to build inside me. Because I suddenly realized I didn't need to expose Mark. I didn't need to confront him in public or stoop to his level. He'd already given me everything I needed to bring about his downfall. He had written his own ending. I just had to sign it. That night, I finally felt peace, not the quiet kind, but the kind that comes from knowing the game has shifted. The power he thought he had, it was already slipping away. And by the time he realized it, it would be far too late to save himself. I sat alone in my home office that night with the house quiet around me. The city lights a soft hum beyond the curtains. The anger that had driven me for the past few weeks had settled into something clearer, a precise, practical focus. I wasn't interested in spectacle or public shaming. I wanted a solution that was solid, defensible, and final. I wanted the problem removed in a way that couldn't be spun into me being overly sensitive or vindictive, so I opened our HR folder and started to read, line by line, the contracts and clauses we'd signed with vendors and service providers. I'd always insisted on thorough contracts for every partnership, not because I expected trouble, but because I wanted stability. Contracts are boring, but they protect you when things get messy. Tonight, those boring pages felt like armor. That's when I found it, tucked into the standard template we'd been using with small creative partners, the kind who filmed event footage or did occasional video work. Was a professionalism clause. It wasn't flashy. It was phrased in legal language, careful and dry. Language about conduct detrimental to the client's brand, public representations, and a right to immediate termination where such conduct endangered reputation or business operations. There was a moral style provision that allowed either party to end the agreement if the other engaged in public conduct which materially harms the reputation of the client. For a second, I simply sat there with the document on the screen, feeling oddly relieved. The clause wasn't malicious. It was sensible. It existed exactly for situations where someone's outside behavior bled into our business life in a damaging way. I opened our vendor list and scrolled down until my eyes landed on a familiar name, Mark's Little Production Company. We'd used them once or twice last year for a short social campaign. Nothing major. A few event clips and an inexpensive edit. At the time, they were convenient, local, and reasonably priced. It had been Sarah who recommended them, and trusting her judgment, I'd signed off without a second thought. The contract had been the standard one, the same contract with that clause included. It all fit together in a way that felt almost too neat. Mark's conduct was public. It was targeted and repeated. It had already circulated among clients. The clause, written in plain contractual language, gave me the power to terminate immediately if his actions were harming us. I felt a wash of conflicting emotions. Vindication, yes, but also a twinge of sorrow. This wasn't about enjoying someone's downfall. It was about protecting the company I'd bled for. Still, there was a moral satisfaction in the fact that the mechanism I needed was already baked into our own agreements. This wasn't a trap I'd set. It was a rule we'd agreed on to keep our professional world clean of personal damage. The next steps were practical. I pulled up every instance of his behavior I could find. Screenshots of the posts, saved videos, timestamps, links, and notes from colleagues who had forwarded me material. I created a chronological folder. The wedding speech, the reposted clip, the meme, the motivational speech on the morning of the client meeting. I annotated each file with dates and short descriptions of where it had appeared, and who might have seen it. Documentation is dull, but in situations like this, it's everything. After I had my evidence organized, I called our corporate counsel. I don't treat legal advice like a last resort. I treat it like insurance. His number answered after 2 rings, and the conversation was brisk and professional. I explained the situation calmly, sending him the folder as I spoke. He read through the clause with the same measured tone I had, then confirmed, yes, the clause was enforceable, and the social media posts, if they were publicly tied to Mark and his company, constituted grounds for immediate termination. He also advised on tone and language so everything would be airtight, factual, unemotional, and strictly contractual language in the termination letter. We discussed risk, too. There was always a risk of backlash, that Mark could spin this as petty, or that Sarah might be collateral damage. He reminded me that the goal was remediation, not humiliation. If Mark's posts genuinely harmed our business, we were within our rights. If he took legal action, frivolous as it might be, the documentation would protect us. He suggested we prepare a concise statement for internal use and a short, careful notice for the vendor record. I felt, oddly, grateful. It's strange to be thankful for the existence of cold legal text, but at that moment it was oddly comforting. There was a principle here: accountability, not revenge. A contract is a promise, and when someone's public actions break that promise and threaten others, the promise has to be enforceable. Next, I pulled HR into the room. I walked down the hall to our HR director's office with the printed files in a neat folder. She and I have always been pragmatic together. We're not the kind to be performative about conflict. I laid the documentation on her desk, and we went over it point by point. The timeline, the client message, the posts, the clause, and the counsel's advice. We rehearsed the conversation I would have with Sarah. I wanted to be firm but fair, and HR was invaluable in helping me script exactly how we would present things. What to say, what to avoid, how to keep the focus on the company's reputation rather than personal vindictiveness. We wrote a clear set of expectations for Sarah: that ongoing public defense of the posts, or continued association with that conduct would create grounds for more serious disciplinary measures. We also made sure the documentation reflected any steps we'd already taken: the initial private conversations, the requests to remove content, and the company-wide reminder about social media conduct. One night, pacing the living room, I ran through the scenario in my head. I imagined calling Sarah in, showing her the evidence, laying out the implications, and presenting the termination as a business action based on a pre-existing contractual right. I rehearsed my tone: calm, clear, unemotional. I didn't want theatrics. I wanted the action to land like a bell, clear, final, unmistakable. There was another piece I needed: the moral clarity to sleep at night. It mattered to me that this not be an abuse of power. I asked myself the hard questions. Could there have been another route? Could I have done more to protect the wedding moment itself? Was firing a third party, someone's spouse, fair? I thought about the clients who'd reached out, about the staff member who sat across from me and looked like she was carrying the weight of someone else's choices. I thought about the early mornings and late nights, the credibility that had to be maintained. Every answer came back to the same place: boundaries. We teach people how to treat us, and sometimes those lessons are learned the hard way. I could not, in good conscience, allow someone to keep undermining the professional environment I'd created under the guise of a joke. The clause existed to prevent exactly this kind of harm. With counsel's memo, HR's notes, and the evidence folder in hand, I drafted the termination letter. It was succinct and factual. Reference to the contract, citation of specific derogatory public posts and dates, statement of immediate termination of services, and a note that the decision was based solely on the material impact to the company. No flourish, no gloat, no personal accusations. The language was cold by design, because cold facts are harder to dispute than hot emotions. I saved the draft, closed my laptop, and sat for a long time. It felt like standing at the edge of a small cliff, the air sharp and clear. The plan was there, honest and legal. It relied on no theatrics, on no rumor, and on no fanciful hope. It relied on the real thing, a contract we'd both agreed to, and the reality of Mark's public, damaging behavior. By the end of the night, I slept differently than I had in weeks. Not lighter, not carefree, but steadier. The strategy had turned my helplessness into purposeful action. The unique weapon, a clause most people gloss over, had become a shield for everything I'd built. And for the first time since the wedding, I felt like the situation could be put right on terms that mattered. When morning came, I walked into the office with the folder under my arm and a resolve that felt, if anything, almost merciful. This was not about making someone suffer. It was about ensuring that the workplace I'd promised my team remained a place of respect. And that, as far as I was concerned, was non-negotiable. I arrived at the office early the next morning, long before anyone else. The stillness of that hour always helped me think, but today it carried a deeper purpose. Calm before something final, I placed the neat folder on my desk, beside a fresh cup of coffee, and watched the city awaken beyond the glass. This was the day I would close a chapter one never asked for but had learned from all the same. Everything was ready. The HR notes, my lawyer's statement, the printed screenshots of Mark's posts, and the termination letter, signed and sealed. All that remained was the conversation. Sarah arrived around 9. She hesitated at my office door, a tentative knock before stepping in. There was a heaviness in her eyes, exhaustion, fear, maybe guilt. I gestured for her to sit, and as she did, I took a slow breath to steady myself. Sarah, I began quietly, I need to talk to you about something serious. I've spent a lot of time reviewing the situation with your husband and how it's affected the company. I've spoken with counsel, HR, and our leadership team. We've made a decision. Her shoulders tensed. She didn't speak. Because of the public posts your husband has made, the ones that target me personally, and have reflected poorly on the company, we'll be terminating our contract with his business. Effective immediately. Her eyes widened, and for a second she looked like she might protest. But I could see the realization wash over her as I slid the folder across the desk. The clause was highlighted, the posts attached in printouts, each dated and documented. There was no emotion in the paper, just facts, steady and cold. I told him to stop, she said finally, her voice breaking. I begged him to. He said it wasn't serious, that you wouldn't take it personally. I kept my tone gentle but firm. I understand. I don't hold you responsible for his choices, but his actions have crossed into our professional world, and that leaves me no other option. This isn't personal, it's business, and it's necessary to protect everyone who works here. She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. He's going to be furious, she whispered. I imagine he will be, I said softly. But that's not something you have to carry for him. I hope, truly, that he'll take this as a lesson in what happens when you let pride lead you into cruelty. There was silence for a long moment before she stood. Her expression was a complicated mix of shame and relief, as though some part of her was grateful that the ordeal was finally being handled. She left my office quietly, and I sat back in my chair, exhaling a long, controlled breath. The termination letter went out that afternoon via certified email, CC'd to our legal counsel. Within minutes, I received the automated delivery receipt, and just like that, it was official. It didn't take long for Mark to respond. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed with a string of missed calls and a single voicemail that I didn't need to play to know its contents. A few minutes later, he sent a long, indignant email, written in all caps. Laced with outrage and self-righteousness, he accused me of overreacting. He claimed his videos were satirical. He tried to twist the narrative, insisting that the bride who can't take a joke had now cost him his livelihood. And then, predictably, came the threat of taking it public. I read the email twice, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to absorb how utterly predictable it was. The tone, the deflection, the lack of accountability, it was all right there in his own words. I forwarded the message to our lawyer, who replied within minutes with a short, perfect response. All further communication will be through counsel. Please refer to the termination clause and the documentation provided. That single sentence was my favorite line I'd read in weeks. Still, I knew better than to assume that was the end of it. People like Mark rarely go quietly, and sure enough, the next day, he made one final attempt to spin things in his favor. He posted a long, dramatic rant online, a kind of manifesto about cancel culture and ungrateful bosses. It was self-pitying and performative, meant to win sympathy. He never used my name, but everyone who knew the context could tell exactly who he was talking about. What he didn't realize was that, this time, he'd gone too far. Not just with me, but with his own network. The comments under his post told a different story than he expected. A few of his friends offered the usual sympathy, but most were tired of his antics. Some even tagged links to his previous videos, pointing out how cruel and obsessive they'd become. One person, a former client of his, shared their own story of how unprofessional he'd been during a project. Another revealed that he'd made jokes at their wedding, too, by the end of the day. The post was flooded with criticism, and eventually, he deleted it. The silence that followed was almost beautiful. A few days later, I received an apologetic email from Sarah. She told me she'd moved out for a while, that she needed distance to think about what she wanted for her future. She thanked me for handling things with dignity, as she put it, and wished me well. I wrote back a short, kind reply, wishing her strength and peace. She didn't deserve the fallout of her husband's ego, but at least she was finally free to see it clearly. By the end of that week, our clients had stopped asking questions. The rumors faded. My team, once tense and whispering, seemed to exhale collectively. It was as if the entire company could finally breathe again. And me? I felt something deeper than relief. Closure. I hadn't needed to scream or seek revenge. I hadn't needed to humiliate him publicly. I'd simply followed the truth, step by step, until it led him to the consequences he'd written for himself. Justice, I realized, doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes, it's a quiet document, signed in ink, delivered by email. Sometimes, it's the sound of a man realizing that his arrogance cost him everything he thought he controlled. And that sound, that silence, really, was more satisfying than any apology could ever be. Asterisk, if there's one thing I've learned about people like Mark, it's that they never expect consequences. They live as if the world will bend for them. That their jokes, their arrogance, their cruelty, will always be excused as personality. So when the reality finally hit him, it wasn't just professional loss. It was personal devastation. The moment when the mirror finally showed him who he really was. It happened a few days after we sent the termination notice. I was in the middle of a meeting when my receptionist buzzed my office, her voice tight. "He's here," she said quietly. "Mark. He's downstairs. He says he wants to talk to you." Now, I could almost hear the air leave the room. I glanced at the HR manager sitting across from me. She raised an eyebrow, already understanding what I was about to say. "Tell him," I said calmly, "that all communication must go through legal counsel, and that I'm unavailable." She nodded and relayed the message. But of course, Mark wasn't the type to accept boundaries. Minutes later, security called up to inform us that he was raising his voice in the lobby. Not quite yelling, but loud enough to draw attention. I excused myself from the meeting, walked to the glass railing overlooking the first floor, and saw him there, pacing. It was almost surreal. The man who'd once stood at my wedding, mic in hand, smirking as he humiliated me in front of everyone, now stood small and frantic under the sterile glow of our office lights. He wasn't dressed for confrontation. No suit, no swagger, just jeans, an old hoodie, and a face twisted with desperation. He spotted me on the balcony and called out, "You're seriously doing this? Over a joke?" The words echoed faintly through the lobby, heads turning, whispers spreading. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I took the stairs down, each step deliberate, calm. When I reached the ground floor, I stopped a few feet from him, maintaining the kind of distance that signals composure, not fear. "Mark," I said evenly, "you've been asked to communicate through legal channels. This isn't the time or place." He laughed, short, hollow, manic. "Come on. You're not really firing me. You're just trying to prove a point. You were never my employee," I corrected gently. "You were a contractor, and that contract has been terminated." His expression hardened. "You think this won't blow back on you? You embarrassed me in front of everyone at your wedding when you made me look like the bad guy." I stopped him there, my tone still calm but firm. "You embarrassed yourself, Mark. You recorded it. You posted it. You made this entire situation public. Not me." For a moment, his mouth opened, but no words came out. His confidence faltered, the performative outrage deflating into something smaller. "You think people don't see what you've done?" I continued. "They've seen the videos. They've read your posts. And now they're seeing the consequences. This isn't about revenge. This is about accountability. The one thing you never learned." His jaw tightened, eyes darting around as if looking for someone, anyone, to validate his anger. But the security guard stood by, impassive. The receptionist avoided his gaze. Even the few employees who'd lingered in the hall stayed silent, watching the scene unfold. He'd lost his audience. And without an audience, men like him lose their power. He took one last step forward, his voice cracking with false bravado. "You think you're better than me? You think this makes you strong?" I met his gaze steadily. "No," I said quietly. "I think it makes me done." That broke him. I could see it. The flush creeping up his neck, the twitch in his jaw. He wanted to shout, to lash out, to reclaim control. But there was nothing left to grab. He muttered something under his breath, something bitter and indistinct, before finally turning and storming out the glass doors. As the doors closed behind him, the silence that followed was almost reverent. The receptionist exhaled audibly. The security guard gave me a small nod. I nodded back, collected my composure, and walked upstairs again, heart steady. Within an hour, I received a text from Sarah. A short, almost painful message. "He just told me what happened. I'm so sorry. You did what you had to. I should have seen this coming." I didn't respond right away. There was nothing more to say. She didn't need reassurance. She needed peace, something she hadn't had in a long time. By that evening, I learned from mutual acquaintances that Mark had started losing contracts with other clients, too. Apparently, Several had quietly decided to end their agreements after seeing how unprofessional he'd become. His reputation, once smugly self-assured, had turned sour in a matter of days. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who humiliated me in public now faced public humiliation of his own. But this time, not because anyone plotted against him. He'd simply revealed himself too many times. The world had finally caught up. There was no need for gloating. No victory dance. Justice had its own rhythm, quiet but absolute. That night, I sat at home with a cup of tea. The same wedding photo album still tucked away in the closet. For the first time since that awful night, I opened it again. I flipped through the pages. The smiles, the laughter, the people who mattered. When I reached the photo of Mark holding the microphone, frozen mid-speech, I felt no anger, only distance. That moment no longer had power over me. He'd tried to define me by that humiliation, but in the end, it defined him instead. And there's something deeply poetic in that. How the same stage he used to mock me became the platform for his own downfall. He wanted attention, and he got it. Just not the kind he expected. It's strange how justice doesn't always arrive with thunder or applause. Sometimes, it comes in the quietest ways. An email, a headline, or the still silence of an empty inbox where chaos used to live. For me, the payoff didn't come as a single dramatic moment, but as a series of small, satisfying realizations that built into something whole. A week after Mark's outburst in the lobby, I received a message from a mutual acquaintance, someone who'd attended our wedding and had known him long before I did. It was short and to the point. You probably already know, but Mark's production company is closing. Apparently, he lost his biggest client this week. They said they can't be associated with the kind of publicity he's been getting. I read the message twice, slowly. There was no triumphal music playing in my mind, just a sense of completion, like a door softly clicking shut behind me. When you've spent months watching someone drag your name through the mud, seeing the truth catch up to them feels less like victory and more like peace. He had built his little empire on charm and mockery, laughing at others to feel powerful. But the same audience he courted with those cruel jokes had grown tired of him. The people he'd thought were laughing with him were, finally, laughing at him. Still, karma wasn't finished yet. A few days later, I got an unexpected phone call from one of our event partners, a polite woman who handled high-profile weddings and corporate functions. She said she wanted to thank me. "We heard what happened," she said gently and honestly. "I wish more people handled things the way you did. We cut ties with Mark's company months ago because of how he treated clients. You did the right thing." I remember sitting back in my chair after that call, staring out the window. The city was bathed in soft afternoon light, and for the first time in months, I felt my shoulders relax completely. Mark had spent so long trying to turn me into the butt of his jokes, his uptight bride caricature, his story to tell at bars and parties. But now, I was no longer a punchline. I was the ending to his. He'd given me humiliation, and I'd given him accountability, and the beauty of it all was that I hadn't had to raise my voice, throw accusations, or stoop to his level. All I'd done was follow the rules he'd agreed to, the same contract he'd signed, the same standards he'd dismissed. Those were the tools of his undoing. Poetic, really. But the most satisfying moment came later. Quiet and almost private. I was going through some paperwork one morning when an email pinged into my inbox. The sender's name made my heart pause for a beat. It was Sarah. Her message was brief but heartfelt. "I wanted to thank you for how you handled everything. I've left Mark, I should have done it sooner. Watching everything fall apart was awful, but it opened my eyes. You were always professional and kind to me, even when I didn't deserve it. I've started interviewing elsewhere, and I'm finally sleeping again. Thank you for standing up for yourself. And, in a way, for me too. I sat there for a long moment, letting the words sink in. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about freedom, hers and mine. I wrote back simply, I wish you all the best, Sarah. You deserve a life without chaos. Take care of yourself. When I hit send, I realized that was the last loose thread, the last part of that story that still lingered in my life. After that, everything settled. My company's reputation recovered quickly, faster than I expected, actually. Clients respected the professionalism of how it had been handled, and some even told me privately that it had made them trust our integrity more. My team grew closer, stronger, more protective of the environment we'd built. And me? I moved forward. I stopped flinching when someone mentioned weddings. I stopped checking social media for his name. I stopped giving that moment, that speech, any power over me. It's incredible how light life feels when you finally let justice do its work. Sometimes people mistake calmness for weakness. They think silence means defeat. But I've learned that silence, when chosen, is power. It's the sound of control returning to your hands. Mark learned that the hard way. He used his words to humiliate me in front of hundreds. I used his own words, the ones he posted publicly, to hold him accountable. That was the irony of it all. The very tool he used to hurt me became the weapon of his own undoing. And in the end, the people who once laughed at his jokes were left shaking their heads, realizing that cruelty always finds its way home. Justice doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through a signed document, a closed door, and a woman who refuses to be humiliated twice. When I look back on it now, I don't think about the wedding anymore. I think about what came after. The moment I chose not to fight dirty, but to fight smart. Because that, in the end, was what saved everything I'd built. And it's what reminded me that even when people try to tear you down for their own amusement, grace and clarity are far sharper weapons than spite will ever be. That was my karma. That was my justice. And I wouldn't change a single thing. It's been over a year since everything with Mark unfolded. And I can finally say that life has found its balance again. Calm, steady, and deeply peaceful. The storm that once consumed my thoughts has long since passed, and in its wake, I've built something stronger, wiser, and far more grounded than before. In the months that followed the ordeal, there were ripples, of course, whispers from people who'd once been in Mark's orbit, curious about what really happened. But over time, even those faded. People always move on to newer dramas. What stays behind is reputation, the quiet proof of who you are when the noise stops. My business thrived. Not just recovered, thrived. Clients began referring us more often, praising our professionalism and grace under pressure. One even told me, I don't know the details, but the way you handled that situation, it spoke volumes about your integrity. That meant more to me than any vindictive victory ever could. Inside the office, the air shifted too. The team became closer, more communicative, almost protective of our shared work environment. The unspoken lesson was clear. That respect and accountability aren't negotiable, no matter how small the offense may seem. I could sense that they'd seen what real leadership looks like, not in the victory itself, but in the way it was earned. And as for me, I learned to breathe again, to stop anticipating the next rumor, the next insult, the next shadow of embarrassment. I no longer flinched at old memories or photos from the wedding. I could even laugh about it, quietly, in private. Time has a way of softening the edges of pain once it's transformed into wisdom. Every so often, I'd hear small updates about Mark, that his business never recovered, that he'd tried to start a podcast, or that he'd moved to another city altogether. I never sought out the details. It wasn't bitterness that stopped me. It was disinterest. His story was no longer part of mine. What did matter was hearing, a few months later, that Sarah had landed a new job with a good company. One afternoon, she sent a short email with her new work signature. "I'm doing really well. Thank you again for everything. For handling things with grace when you could have easily destroyed us. I won't forget that." I smiled when I read it. That was the kind of ending I hoped for her. Not dramatic, not glamorous, but peaceful. Because sometimes peace is the truest form of freedom. I'd kept the old termination folder tucked away in a filing cabinet, just in case I ever needed it again. But a few weeks ago, while reorganizing, I pulled it out and flipped through the documents. The screenshots, the emails, the contract clause highlighted in yellow. They all felt distant, like artifacts from a life I'd already outgrown. Without a second thought, I shredded them. The sound of the paper feeding through the machine was oddly satisfying. Each sheet that disappeared felt like a final echo fading into nothingness. What once represented pain now represented closure. Sometimes people think justice is about watching someone fall apart. But it's not. True justice is walking away from the wreckage with your head held high, knowing you didn't have to become cruel to survive cruelty. That's what I took from all this. That dignity isn't silence. It's restraint. It's the ability to act with precision and purpose, even when you've been deeply wronged. I didn't need to ruin Mark's life. He did that himself. I only held up the mirror, and the reflection did the rest. These days, when people ask about that chapter of my life, I don't tell the story for sympathy or applause. I tell it because it's a reminder to myself and to anyone listening that boundaries are not cruelty, that professionalism is not coldness, and that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it signs a document. Sometimes it simply says, "No more." And in those quiet moments, when the noise fades and peace settles in again, you realize that the best revenge was never revenge at all. It was healing, growth, and the power to move forward without looking back. I got my justice. He got his lesson. And life, in all its strange symmetry, carried on. The story ended exactly as it should have. Not with anger, but with peace. And I finally learned that sometimes the softest victories are the loudest ones of all. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.